The fluorescent light above my hospital bed flickered twice before steadying itself. I remember staring at it, thinking how strange it was that I noticed something so small while the cardiologist stood at the foot of my bed explaining what a widowmaker heart attack meant and why I was lucky to still be breathing. My phone buzzed on the bedside tray. My son's name lit up the screen. I answered because that's what fathers do. Dad, I need you to come by the house this weekend. Marcus's promotion party is Saturday. I already told everyone you'd handle the grill. I looked down at the IV line, running into my left arm. The heart monitor beeped steadily beside me. I had been in the cardiac ICU for less than 18 hours. So, I said carefully, I'm in the hospital. I had a heart attack yesterday morning. There was a pause. Not the kind of pause that comes from shock or fear. The kind that comes from recalculation. How serious is it? Serious enough that I'm in intensive care. Another pause. Then, so you're saying you can't make it Saturday? I closed my eyes. 63 years on this earth. And I had raised a son who heard heart attack and translated it into a scheduling conflict. I'm saying I had a heart attack. Daniel, his voice shifted into something I had learned to recognize over the past few years, that particular tone he used when he felt inconvenienced by something that wasn't about him. Dad? I've already sent the invitations. Marcus has been looking forward to this. You're the one who always said family shows up. I'm lying in a cardiac unit. The doctors would tell you if it was actually dangerous. You're probably fine. You're strong. I said nothing. If you can't do it, just say so. He said, but don't make me rearrange everything last minute because you're being dramatic. I hung up. I didn't call back. I set the phone face down on the tray and watched the monitor track my heartbeat and thought about the 31 years I had spent building a life that my son had just called dramatic. My name is Robert Calloway. I am 63 years old. For 22 years, I worked as a structural engineer for a firm in Portland, Oregon, eventually becoming a senior partner. When my wife Carol passed away from cancer 6 years ago, I sold the house we had shared for decades and bought a smaller place in the Eastmoreland neighborhood, a craftsman bungalow with a big backyard and a porch I had always imagined sitting on in the evenings. I had savings. I had a pension. I had investments. Carol and I had built together carefully over 4 decades. I had a life that was modest, but genuinely mine. I also had Daniel. He was 34. He worked in sales for a software company, made decent money, and had been married to his wife Renee for 5 years. They had met at a conference in Seattle, dated for 8 months, and gotten engaged before I had exchanged more than a few dozen words with her. I tried not to hold that against either of them. People move fast. I understood that what I did not understand, and what I should have drawn a line around much earlier, was how quickly family shows up became a phrase that only ever applied to me. It had started small, the way these things always do, a loan to cover a car repair. When Daniel's transmission failed 2 years into their marriage, $600. Never mentioned again as something to be repaid. Then a larger loan for first and last month's rent when they moved into a nicer apartment in the Pearl District, a neighborhood I privately thought was beyond their means, but said nothing about. Then another loan when Renee decided to open a small boutique and needed startup capital, and the bank required more collateral than they had. I gave because I could, and because he was my son, and because Carol would have given too. I told myself that the boutique closed after 11 months. They asked me about the loan 7 months after it closed. Not to repay it, to ask if I considered it forgiven. Since the business hadn't worked out, I said yes. I told myself that too. By the time I ended up in the cardiac ICU on a Thursday morning in October, I had given, or lent the distinction, had dissolved somewhere along the way, just over $40,000, across 6 years. I want to be clear. I am not a wealthy man, but I am a careful one. That money had not broken me. What had broken, something quieter and harder to name, was the fact that not one of those transactions had ever been accompanied by the words, "Thank you," without my having to wait for them. The heart attack came without warning, the way they apparently often do. I had been in my backyard on a Wednesday afternoon, pulling up the last of the season's tomato plants, when something in my chest tightened, and then squeezed with a pressure I had no previous language for. I sat down on the ground between the raised beds and called 911 myself because there was no one else to call. The paramedics arrived in 8 minutes. They told me later that those 8 minutes and my decision to sit rather than walk inside and lie down had probably saved my life. The blockage was severe. I had a stent placed that evening. The cardiologist said I would need 2 to 3 weeks of monitored rest before any discussion of returning to normal activity. I lay in that hospital bed for 4 days. Daniel called once more, on the second day, to let me know that the party had gone well and that Marcus had been promoted to regional manager, which was great news. He mentioned at the end, almost as an afterthought, that he hoped I was feeling better. My neighbor Pat, a retired schoolteacher who had lived 3 doors down for 15 years, brought me home from the hospital on a Monday. She had watered my plants while I was gone. She had also, without being asked, left a casserole in my refrigerator with a note that said, "Don't try to be a hero. Call me if you need anything," which I thought was exactly the right thing to say to a man who had spent his whole adult life being careful not to need too much from anyone. I spent the first week home moving slowly and sleeping more than I had in years. My doctor had been clear: no stress, no heavy lifting, no skipping the medication, no pretending I was fine before I was fine. I followed the instructions the way I had always followed instructions, completely and without cutting corners. Daniel came by on the Thursday of that first week. I was on the porch when his car pulled up. The same Audi I had helped him finance 2 years ago because his credit score had made the interest rate prohibitive. He came up the porch steps and sat in the other chair, and we talked for 40 minutes. He asked about my recovery. He told me about work. He mentioned that he and Renee had been thinking about buying a house. I did not react to that. I had learned, over the years, to hear the opening note of these conversations and stay quiet. "We've been looking in Lake Oswego," he said. "There's a place that's perfect. 4 bedrooms, good school district even though we don't have kids yet. Nice yard. That's a nice area." I said, "It's not cheap." He said, "But it's an investment." "Right, that's what you always said about real estate." I said that about buying within your means. "Yes." He looked out at the yard. "We're a little short on the down payment. The house is listed at $640. We'd need 20% to avoid PMI. And we're sitting at about 70. We need about 58 more." I watched a sparrow land on the bird feeder Pat had given me for Christmas 2 years ago. "Dad, I heard you. It's not a gift. It's a loan. We'd draw up actual paperwork this time." I thought about the $40,000. I thought about the word "this time," and what it quietly acknowledged about every previous time. I thought about lying on the ground between my tomato plants. "Alone?" Dialing 3 numbers. "I need to think about it," I said. He nodded as though this was a formality, as though thinking about it was just a brief delay before the answer we both knew was coming. He left an hour later. I sat on the porch until dark. What I had not told Daniel, what I had not told anyone except my attorney and my accountant, was that 3 months before my heart attack, I had made a significant decision about my finances. I had spent the previous year working part-time as a consulting engineer on a large infrastructure project for the city of Portland. The contract had been more lucrative than I anticipated, combined with some investment decisions I had made quietly over the previous 2 years. I was in a considerably stronger financial position than my visible lifestyle suggested. I was not wealthy in the way that word gets used loosely. I was secure in the way that word should always mean. But I had also, with the help of my attorney, restructured how my assets were held. This was not about Daniel specifically. It was about what I had learned in my 60s that I had not understood in my 40s, that the way you hold your assets is a statement about what you value and what you intend to protect. Most of what I owned was now held in a revocable living trust. The bungalow, the investments, the pension, everything. My attorney had walked me through the structure in detail. It was clean, legal, and completely invisible to anyone who did not have reason to look. Daniel did not know about the trust. Daniel also did not know what I found out. 3 weeks after his visit to my porch, I had a longtime friend named Gerald, who had worked in the county assessor's office for many years before his retirement. We had lunch every few weeks and talked about the things men in their 60s talk about: health, grandchildren. Neither of us had yet. The cost of property taxes, the particular pleasure of a good book read slowly. Gerald still had friends in the office, people who mentioned things in passing over their own lunches. One afternoon, Gerald called me and said, carefully, that I might want to pull up the public records search on my property address. I did it that afternoon. Someone had submitted a deed transfer request on my property. The submission had been flagged and put on hold because of a procedural irregularity. Specifically, the signature on the notarized document did not match the signature on file from my original purchase. The flagging had prevented it from processing, but the attempt was in the record. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Then I called my attorney. His name was Warren, and I had used him for estate planning and the occasional contract review for over a decade. He was methodical and thorough, and entirely without drama, which was exactly what I needed. I described what Gerald had told me. I gave him the case number from the public record. He said he would look into it and call me back. He called me back in 2 hours. The submission had included a deed of gift, a document in which a property owner voluntarily transfers their property to another party as a gift, requiring no purchase price. The names on the receiving end of that deed were Daniel Calloway and Renee Calloway. Someone had forged my signature on a notarized document, attempting to transfer my house to my son and his wife as a gift. Warren told me to let him handle the next steps. He was already in contact with the county. He recommended I also contact the Portland Police Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit. He reminded me, in the careful way of a man who has spent decades delivering difficult information, that the trust structure meant the transfer would have been legally invalid regardless. The property was not held in my personal name, and a personal deed of gift could not have transferred trust property, but that did not change what the attempt represented. I asked him who had submitted the documents. He said the notary information was traceable, and that the investigation would determine that. But he also said that the address listed on the submitting party's contact information was a Pearl District apartment, the same apartment Daniel and Renee had rented with my assistants 4 years ago and where they still live. I hung up and sat in the kitchen until it was dark. Then I turned on the lights and made dinner and ate it at the table the way I always had. Because falling apart was not something I intended to do in my own kitchen. I want to be honest about what I felt in those days. I had spent enough time with my own thoughts during my recovery to have arrived at a kind of clarity about my son and about myself. I was not surprised in the way you are surprised, when something happens that you could not have imagined. I was surprised in the way you are surprised when something you quietly feared turns out to be true. There is a difference. One is shock. The other is grief. I grieved for about a week. Then I got to work. Warren coordinated with the Financial Crimes Unit. The investigation moved more quickly than I expected, in part because the notary whose name had been used on the fraudulent document had not actually notarized anything for my son or his wife. Her stamp had been copied from a legitimate document she had processed years ago, a technique that left clear forensic evidence. The case built itself with very little drama. What I needed to handle separately was the conversation with Daniel. I called him on a Tuesday morning and asked him to come over that afternoon. I said I wanted to talk about the loan request. He arrived at 2 o'clock, looking relaxed, wearing a jacket I did not recognize, and carrying 2 cups of coffee from a shop I knew was expensive. He handed me one and sat down at my kitchen table, as though it were his own. "I've been thinking about your request," I said. "I figured," he said. He was smiling slightly, the smile of a man who had already counted on a particular outcome. "I've also had some time to review my financial records over the past few months." Something shifted in his expression. Just a fraction. Just at the edges. But I had been reading this face for 34 years. "I noticed some activity I wanted to ask you about," I said, "specifically around my property records." The coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward. I sat in my own kitchen chair, in my own kitchen, and spoke the way I had spoken in 30 years of professional meetings when the numbers did not add up clearly, and without theater. I told him what I knew. I told him about the deed transfer attempt. I told him about the investigation. I told him about the forensic evidence on the notary stamp. I told him that my attorney had already been in contact with the county, and that the Financial Crimes Unit had opened a formal case. I also told him something he did not know. I told him about the trust. I explained that even if the deed transfer had processed, it would have been legally void, because the property was not held in my name alone. I explained the structure in enough detail that he would understand the attempt had been not only criminal but also, practically speaking, doomed from the beginning. He was very quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't know about the trust." "I know," I said. "Dad, I need you to understand something." I said, "I am 63 years old. I had a heart attack in my own backyard and called an ambulance by myself because there was no one with me. I spent 4 days in a hospital. And in that time you called once to tell me about your brother-in-law's promotion. You came to visit me when you wanted to ask me for money. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, someone used my name and my property to attempt a fraud." He started to speak. "I'm not finished," I said. I told him that the investigation would proceed, regardless of anything between us personally, because that was how investigations worked, and because I had not asked Warren to pursue it less thoroughly because of our relationship. I told him that I did not know the full extent of what Renee had been involved in, and what he had known, and that the investigation would determine that. I told him that I was not going to tell him what to do next, but that I strongly recommended he consult his own attorney. He sat across from me for a long time. The expensive coffee went cold when he finally spoke. What he said was not what I expected. He did not deny everything. He did not perform outrage. He looked at the table and said, quietly, "Renee found the idea online. Some forum about property transfers. She said it was technically legal, if you were willing. I thought maybe, if the paperwork was just there, you would." He stopped. I told myself you would have agreed eventually anyway. I looked at my son for a long moment. "You told yourself I would have agreed to give you my house," I said. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. "I need you to leave now," I said. "Not because I'm angry, although I am, because I need to think, and I can't do that while you're sitting there." He stood up. He left the coffee cup on my table. He walked to the door and then paused with his hand on the frame. "Dad, I'm sorry." "I know," I said. He left. The investigation took another 2 months. I will not walk through every detail because some of it was tedious and some of it was painful and none of it was dramatic in the way people seem to want these things to be. What I can tell you is that Renee was the primary architect of the attempt. Daniel had known, and had not stopped it, and had not told me, which carried its own legal weight, even if it was less than direct participation. The district attorney's office ultimately charged Renee with 1 count of forgery and 1 count of attempted property fraud. The case was still working through the courts when I am telling you this story. Daniel was not charged. That was the determination of the investigation. Not mine. What happened between Daniel and me is harder to describe than what happened in a courtroom. He called me the week after I had asked him to leave. I did not answer. He called again 3 days later. I did not answer. On the 3rd call I picked up and said, "I'm not ready." And he said, "Okay." And we hung up. I spent those weeks doing the things I had learned to do in the years since Carol died, working in the garden, having lunch with Gerald, sitting on the porch in the evenings, reading the books I had been meaning to read for years. I had a follow-up appointment with my cardiologist, who told me my recovery was going well and that my stress levels should stay low. I did not tell him what had happened. I just nodded and took that as a specific professional instruction. I spoke to my pastor once, briefly, not about God particularly, but about the older question that underlies every conversation about family and betrayal, whether love is something you give unconditionally or something you give with the expectation that it will be respected. She did not give me an answer, which I thought was the right response. She asked me what I wanted the relationship with my son to look like in 10 years. I said I didn't know yet. She said that was an honest answer, and probably a healthier starting point than a conclusion reached in anger. I thought about that for a long time. 3 months after the conversation in my kitchen, Daniel called, and I answered, and we talked for almost 2 hours. I will not tell you we resolved everything, because we didn't. I will tell you he said things I needed to hear, not performed apologies, but specific ones. He said he had known the plan was wrong and done it anyway because he had spent years telling himself that what I had would eventually be his and that he was just moving the timeline. He said hearing himself say that out loud made him understand, possibly for the first time, what he had actually been doing. He said he had started seeing a therapist and that 2 sessions in he had cried for the first time in years. I told him I appreciated him saying those things. I told him I was not ready to pretend the previous 6 years had been something other than what they were. I told him I still loved him in the way you love someone you have known since they were a person you held in a hospital room on the best day of your life. I told him that love and trust were different things and that one of them was automatic and the other one was not. He said he understood. I told him we could talk again in another few weeks. And we did. And we have continued to. I do not know what our relationship will look like in a year or in 5 years. I know it will be different from what it was, which, if I am being honest, is not entirely a loss. What it was had not been working for a long time, for either of us, in ways that neither of us had been willing to name. What I know clearly is this: the bungalow is mine, the porch is mine, the garden where I nearly died between the tomato plants, that is mine too. And I replanted it this spring. And the tomatoes are coming in better than last year. I am 63 years old, and I had a heart attack. And my son tried to take my house. And I am still here. I sat on my porch last Tuesday evening as the light went gold over the rooftops. And Pat waved from down the street. And the sparrows came to the feeder Carol's friend had given me for Christmas. And I thought about what my cardiologist had said in those first hours after the stent, when I had asked him, still half sedated, whether I was going to be all right. He had said, "You're going to need to take care of yourself the way you would take care of someone you love." I had not thought, at the time, that this was advice about anything other than my heart. I think about it differently now. If you've stayed with me through this story, I want to ask you something before you go, and I mean this genuinely. Not as a formality. Have you ever looked up one day and realized that the version of a relationship you had been protecting no longer existed, and hadn't for a long time, Leave your answer in the comments. I read them. They matter to me more than you might think. And if this story reached you in some way, if it said something you needed to hear or made you feel less alone in something you've been carrying, please share it with someone who might need it too. There are more of us out here than we realize. Sitting on our porches. Taking care of ourselves, finally. Watching the light change. I'll see you in the next one.